London, 1888. The fog rolled in thick over the cobblestone streets of Whitechapel, swirling like ghosts around the gas lamps that barely pierced the darkness. In the distance, the rhythmic clip-clop of horse hooves echoed off narrow brick walls, while shadows danced in doorways where decent folk feared to tread. This was a city divided where the wealthy lived in grand mansions, just miles away from some of the most desperate slums in all of Europe, and in these forgotten corners of the East End, fear crept like a virus through the alleyways, spreading from person to person in hushed whispers and nervous glances, because someone was hunting women in the dark, a predator unlike any the world had ever seen. He moved through the night like death itself, striking without warning, killing with surgical precision, and vanishing without a trace. He was never caught, never identified. His true face remains a mystery to this day, but the brutality of his crimes, and the cold precision with which he struck, etched his name into the darkest pages of history forever. They called him Jack the Ripper, and what he did still haunts the world more than a century later. This is his story, a tale of terror that transformed a city, changed how we understand evil, and gave birth to our modern fascination with serial killers. To understand Jack the Ripper, you must first understand the world he inhabited. Victorian London in 1888 was a city of impossible contrast, place where unprecedented wealth existed alongside crushing poverty, where elegant carriages rolled past, beggars dying in the streets. In the East End, particularly in the district of Whitechapel, overcrowded tenements and filthy lodging houses packed the desperate together like sardines. Families of 8 or 10 lived in single rooms. Disease ran rampant. Clean water was a luxury most couldn't afford. Here, survival meant making impossible choices. Many women, with no other options, turned to prostitution just to afford a bed for the night. For 4pence, you could rent a bed in a common lodging house. Without it, you slept on the streets, vulnerable to weather, disease, and worse. Violence wasn't rare in Whitechapel. Drunken brawls, domestic disputes, and petty crimes were daily occurrences. The police were overwhelmed, understaffed, and frankly, not particularly concerned with protecting the area's most vulnerable residents. But in the late summer of 1888, something new arrived in these fog-shrouded streets, something more precise than the usual street violence, more gruesome than anything the hardened residents had ever witnessed, more terrifying in its calculated brutality. The first victim was Mary Ann Nichols, known to locals as Polly. On the morning of August 31st, 1888, her body was discovered lying in Bucks Row, a narrow street barely wide enough for a cart to pass through. What the police found would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Polly's throat had been slashed, twice, first to silence her, then deeper to ensure death. But the killer hadn't stopped there. Her abdomen had been ripped open with savage precision, revealing an anatomical knowledge that chilled investigators to the bone. Crucially, there was no robbery. Her few possessions remained untouched. No sexual assault. No obvious motive, just calculated, methodical brutality that served no purpose anyone could understand. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. This was something else entirely. Then, just 8 days later, the killer struck again. Annie Chapman, known as Dark Annie, was found behind a lodging house at 29 Hanbury Street. The scene was even more horrific than the first. Her body had been disemboweled with surgical precision. Her uterus had been completely removed and taken away, evidence of anatomical knowledge that suggested medical training. The killer had worked in near-total darkness, yet his cuts were clean, purposeful, methodical. This wasn't random violence. This was deliberate. Someone was hunting specific victims, killing them in specific ways, for reasons no one could fathom. Panic began to ripple through Whitechapel like wildfire. Women who had walked these streets fearlessly for years now travelled in groups, peering nervously into every shadow. Under newspapers, they smelled blood in more ways than one. This story had everything: mystery, horror, class, conflict, and a villain who seemed to come from the pages of a Gothic novel. The press coverage was about to turn a local tragedy into an international sensation. By September, all of London was watching Whitechapel. Police patrols had increased, vigilante groups formed. The entire district felt like a powder keg ready to explode. But the killer wasn't deterred. If anything, the attention seemed to energize him. On the night of September 30th, 1888, he proved just how bold he had become. In what would later be called the double event, Jack the Ripper killed not one, but two women in the same night, within the span of just 45 minutes. The first victim was Elizabeth Stride, found in Dutfield's yard, around 1 a.m. Her throat had been slashed deeply, but unlike the others, there was no abdominal mutilation. Police immediately suspected the killer had been interrupted perhaps by the approaching footsteps of Louis Dimschitz, who discovered the body. But here's what makes this night truly terrifying. Instead of fleeing the area after nearly being caught, the Ripper simply moved on to complete his work elsewhere. Just 45 minutes later, and less than a mile away, Catherine Eddowes was discovered in Mitre Square. This time, there had been no interruption. Catherine's face was mutilated beyond recognition, carved with a precision that spoke of twisted artistry. Her left kidney had been skillfully removed and taken, but perhaps most chilling of all was what police found nearby. Written in chalk on a wall near the crime scene were the words, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." The message was clearly connected to the murder, but its meaning remained a mystery. Was it a clue, a red herring, or something more sinister? By morning, London was in complete chaos. 2 murders in one night. The killer was escalating, becoming bolder, more brazen. He was taunting not just the police, but the entire city. And then, the newspapers gave him exactly what he seemed to want. A name that would echo through history. They called him Jack the Ripper. The name came from a letter received by the Central News Agency, signed with those very words. Whether it was genuine or a hoax remains debated to this day, but the name stuck and it perfectly captured the public's imagination. "Dear boss," the letter began, "I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track." The writer claimed responsibility for the murders and promised more to come, signing it with a flourish, "Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." But it was the next letter that truly terrified London. This one arrived at the home of George Lusk, chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. It was shorter, more direct, and came with something that made even hardened investigators sick to their stomachs. From hell, it read simply, "Mr. Lusk, so I send you half the kidney I took from one woman. I fried and ate it was very nice. Enclosed was half of a human kidney, preserved in spirits. Medical examination confirmed it was indeed human, and appeared to match what had been removed from Catherine Eddowes. Whether genuine or an elaborate hoax by someone with access to human organs, it sent shockwaves through the investigation and the public alike. The city was gripped by fear unlike anything in living memory. Jack the Ripper had become more than a killer. He had become a symbol of urban terror, proof that even in the world's most powerful city, a monster could hunt freely in the shadows. By November 1888, London had been holding its breath for months. Police patrols were constant. The press coverage was relentless. Every shadow could hide death. Every stranger could be the killer. And then, on November 9th, Jack the Ripper struck for what would be the final time. Mary Jane Kelly was different from the other victims in almost every way. She was young only, 25 years old. She was considered beautiful by the standards of her time, and most importantly, she was killed indoors, in the privacy of her own rented room at Miller's Court. Kelly had been out drinking on the night of November 8th, returning to her small, dingy room sometime after midnight. What happened next would become the stuff of nightmares. A crime so brutal that even experienced detectives would never fully recover from what they witnessed. When her landlord came to collect overdue rent the next morning, he peered through the broken window of her room and immediately summoned the police. What they found when they broke down the door was almost beyond human comprehension. Mary Jane Kelly's body was virtually unrecognizable. The killer had taken his time hours, perhaps systematically dismembering and flaying his victim with surgical precision. Organs had been carefully removed and placed around the room like grotesque decorations, as if the killer was creating some twisted work of art. For the first time, the Ripper had been able to work without fear of interruption, in adequate light, with all the time he needed, and the result was his most horrific masterpiece. The level of anatomical knowledge displayed was extraordinary. This was someone who understood human anatomy better than most doctors. Crime scene photographs were taken, some of the earliest forensic photography in British history, but they were so disturbing that they were immediately sealed away, deemed graphic for public consumption. Even hardened police officers requested transfers rather than continue working the case. The investigation that followed was unprecedented in its scope. Every doctor, butcher, medical student, and veterinarian in London became a potential suspect. The police interviewed hundreds of people, followed thousands of leads, and even consulted early criminal probes. But despite the extensive evidence, despite having the killer's most complete work to analyze, despite the massive investigation, they found nothing. No witnesses, no physical evidence that led to a suspect, no breakthrough that solved the case, and then something even more mysterious happened. After Mary Jane Kelly, the killings simply stopped. No more bodies appeared in Whitechapel. No more letters arrived at newspapers, no more messages scrawled on walls. Jack the Ripper vanished as suddenly and mysteriously as he had appeared. The shadow that had terrorized London for 3 months disappeared into history, leaving behind only questions, theories, and the memories of 5 brutally murdered women. It was as if the killer had achieved whatever twisted goal he had set for himself and simply melted back into the anonymous masses of Victorian London. In the 135 years since Jack the Ripper's reign of terror ended, the case has consumed investigators, amateur detectives, and true crime enthusiasts like few others in history. Hundreds of suspects have been proposed, each with their own compelling evidence and glaring contradictions. The suspects read like a who's who of Victorian society's most controversial figures. Doctors with access to anatomy knowledge, butchers familiar with dissection, foreign immigrants who fit the RR's xenophobic prejudices. Even members of the royal family haven't escaped suspicion. Dr. Thomas Neil Cream, a serial killer who poisoned prostitutes, confessed to being Jack the Ripper moments before his execution despite being in prison in America during the Whitechapel murders. Aaron Kosminski, a Polish immigrant with a history of mental illness, was suspected by police at the time but never conclusively linked to the crimes. Perhaps most sensationally, Prince Albert Victor, grandson of Queen Victoria, was accused by some theorists of being the Ripper, or at least connected to a royal conspiracy to cover up the murders. These theories, while lacking credible evidence, demonstrate how the case has captured imaginations across all levels of society. The artist Walter Sickert became a suspect partly due to his dark paintings of murder scenes and his intimate knowledge of the Whitechapel area. Some theories suggest he was either the killer himself or had detailed knowledge of the crimes that he incorporated into his art. Modern criminal profiling has added new dimensions to the investigation. FBI profilers have suggested the killer was likely a local resident, familiar with Whitechapel's maze-like streets. He would have appeared normal to his neighbors, organized, intelligent, possibly charming, someone who could blend in seamlessly with Victorian society. The geographic pattern of the murders suggests someone who lived or worked in the area. The timing all killings occurred on weekends or holidays implies someone with a regular work schedule. The anatomical precision points to medical knowledge, but not necessarily formal training. DNA analysis has been attempted on surviving evidence, with mixed and controversial results. In 2014, author Russell Edwards claimed DNA evidence proved Aaron Kosminski was the killer, but the scientific community largely rejected these findings due to contamination concerns and methodological flaws. The truth is, the Victorian police were working with the investigative tools of their time. Fingerprinting hadn't been invented. DNA was decades away from discovery. Photography was primitive. Criminal psychology barely existed as a field. What they did have were witness statements that contradicted each other, physical evidence that could tell them how but not who, and a killer smart enough to avoid detection in an era when avoiding detection was far easier than it is today. Perhaps that's why the case remains so compelling. In our age of surveillance, cameras, and forensic science, the idea that someone could commit such heinous crimes and simply vanish seems almost impossible. Yet Jack the Ripper did exactly that. Leaving behind only the echo of his footsteps in the fog, Jack the Ripper changed far more than newspaper headlines or police procedures. He fundamentally altered how society understands and responds to serial violence, creating a template that still influences our culture more than a century later. The Ripper case led to revolutionary changes in police work. Crime scene photography became standard practice. Detective work evolved from simple questioning to methodical investigation. The concept of criminal profiling, understanding the psychology behind the crimes, began to take shape. For women, particularly those in vulnerable circumstances, the Ripper murders represented a new kind of fear. This wasn't random violence or crimes of passion, this was systematic hunting. It changed how women moved through urban spaces, how they perceived safety, and how society discussed violence against women. The media coverage of the Ripper case also established many of the patterns we see in modern true crime reporting. The sensational headlines, the public fascination with gory details, the creation of a larger-than-life villain, all of these elements became standard in how society processes and consumes stories of serial violence. Jack the Ripper became the archetype for the serial killer in popular culture. Every fictional murderer who followed from Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde to Hannibal Lecter owes something to the template established in those fog-shrouded streets of Whitechapel. The case has inspired countless books, films, television shows, and even video games. Tours of Whitechapel still draw thousands of visitors annually, eager to walk the same streets where history's most famous unsolved murders took place. But perhaps most significantly, the Ripper murders coincided with and contributed to a shift in how we understand evil itself. The Victorian era's faith in progress and civilization was shaken by the realization that monsters could walk among us, undetected and unpunished. Modern serial killer investigations still reference the Ripper case. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit studies the patterns he established. Police departments worldwide have learned from both the successes and failures of the original investigation. Yet for all our advances in forensic science, criminal psychology, and investigative techniques, we still can't answer the most basic questions about Jack the Ripper. Who was he? Why did he kill? And why did he stop? Today, Whitechapel has been transformed. Gleaming office buildings and trendy restaurants have replaced the slums and lodging houses. The cobblestone streets are well lit and patrolled. The area that once represented London's darkest corners has become gentrified, sanitized, safe, but the echoes remain. In every unsolved case, every unexplained disappearance, every moment when we realize how little we truly know about the strangers who walk among us, Jack the Ripper's shadow still falls across our collective consciousness. He walked the same streets as ordinary men and women. He vanished into fog, into history, into myth, but what he did, the fear he inspired, the questions he raised about human nature never truly left us, because the most terrifying truth about Jack the Ripper isn't that he killed 5 women in 1888. It's that he proved monsters don't always live in cages or asylums, or the pages of Gothic novels. Sometimes they live in shadows, sometimes they live next door, and sometimes they never leave. The case of Jack the Ripper remains open. The shadow still stalks, and somewhere in the mists of history, the most famous killer who never got caught continues to haunt our darkest nightmares. If you found this story as disturbing and fascinating as we did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you never miss another deep dive into history's darkest corners. This is UTAK Diaries, where truth is stranger than fiction, and the past never truly stays buried.